Thanks for downloading this episode of the Resilient Advisor Podcast. My name is Jay Coulter, and joining me today for this interview is Andrew Chanin, who is the co-founder and CEO of a unique company called ProcureAM. This company has just launched the first pure play space ETF. And I love these types of podcasts because we get to talk about spaces that I have no experience in and most advisors haven't even thought about. Andrew, thanks for coming on.
Thanks for having me, Jay.
All right, so your ETF launched in April, and we'll get into the details of that in a minute. But what's interesting is we're coming up on the 50th anniversary of the Apollo 11 launch. There's going to be a lot of hoopla about it. I believe it's in mid-July. But man, things have changed over 50 years. Tell us a little bit about the space industry.
So you're absolutely right. A lot has changed in the last 50 years. Originally, the space industry was almost entirely dominated by spending from governments and government agencies. So you think European Space Agency and you think NASA are some of the two that come to mind. And one of these biggest changes that we've seen over the last 50 years or so is actually the emergence of the commercialization of space. So up until most recently, we're actually at about 80% of the space industry is represented by commercial interest, with only about 20% of that funding and support coming from governments and government agencies. So we really kind of...
Andrew, let me ask a question about that. That shocks me. So is that in the last 5 years with folks like Elon Musk and Virgin trying to get in the space, or has that been a slow trend since the 1950s?
So it was a slow trend back in the 1950s, 60s, 70s, and really in the 80s and onwards, we started seeing commercial interest really grow in the space industry. So, this 80% number has gotten there, over many years, but most of this growth of the commercialization of space has really come in, call it, the last 20 years. Mm-hmm. But really, many of the projections that we're seeing out there from various experts in the space and financial research houses expect that trend to actually grow. So where the space industry was completely reliant originally on government agencies and governments and their spending, we're actually now seeing this transition where government agencies are actually realizing the importance of commercial efforts to help them not only achieve their goals, but also to create those next pieces of technology that are going to help them further their own interests. So it's really this collaborative industry. And there are several reasons why the space industry has changed even kind of beyond that, but it's really been pushed by this commercial interest of recently.
So has the government spending on space gone down and the vacuum has been filled by commercial, or has the government continued to spend at the same level and the industry and the commercialization is just extra? Is more, significantly more spending on top?
Yeah, so a lot of the commercial interest has actually helped with in the communications area. So whether it's broadband of late, internet TV, internet radio, things like that, it's really telecom that's been helping drive the kind of consumer and commercialization push. A lot of the government issues and initiatives are kind of similar. It's exploring, it's staking a claim. But a lot of the spending has pulled back, but in some countries might pull back where you'll see an increase in spending from other countries. So the amount that they're spending is pretty steady, but the big push is coming from commercialization. So certain things like technologies like GPS, which we might take for granted, when you think about space, you might not think about GPS as being one of those technologies that are enabling our everyday life. Where you think of things like, Uber and Lyft, they wouldn't be able to operate without the satellite GPS technology. Same with Google Maps. It's using satellite imagery. So there's a lot of things that are going behind the scene that people might not necessarily associate space. But if you took out that whole space component, those technologies wouldn't even work.
How is the government's interest in creating a space force now going to impact the space industry?
So it's tough to tell. They're still kind of mapping out how this will look. And there already has been kind of a space group already in the government within the Air Force. So it's really kind of carving it out and making it its own separate entity. That is a big push in recent talks. But just from how I look at it, the U.S. government is always spending a huge amount of our budget on defense. And the idea that we would create a space force, all of our spending is on competition, and we outspend almost every other country combined in some of these efforts. And in my mind, space would be another one of those arenas that we wouldn't want to lose out on. So to the extent that we see China building a permanent lunar colony and other countries expanding their capabilities, it only seems just natural for the U.S. to want to compete. And the way that we compete is by spending more.
Yeah, that makes perfect sense. So when I was preparing for this interview, I realized that I've never really thought about space as an investment opportunity. In fact, I generally think about billionaires that might be a little bit off their rocker trying to build companies to do things for show, if I ever thought about space to any degree. What are the misconceptions about this space economy?
So everyone actually has a completely different interpretation of what space means to them. And space is a much more tangible arena than people actually think. So we mentioned GPS and satellite imagery as being things that help kind of people relate and understand to how space is actually affecting their current everyday life. But kind of taking it back another step, there's a couple areas that we've seen out there recently as kind of transformational technologies that have been receiving billions of dollars of investment into them. Some of these are things like cloud computing, 5G, Internet of Things and connected devices, big data, machine learning. All of these areas are seeing tremendous amount of investment dollars. What people don't realize is that they're actually reliant in many cases upon satellite-based systems and space networks. And so if you remove the satellite component from cloud computing, from 5G, all those industries that I mentioned are going to be creating so much data and utilizing so much data. And that data needs to get from point A to point B in most cases. And most people don't realize that these satellite companies are actually the global toll booth operators for this digital transformation and this digital superhighway that we're seeing from all these other technologies. So I think what's really important is actually helping people understand what is space. So it's not just the rocket ships and the spacecrafts that you're seeing, but it's the satellite manufacturers and the operators and these telecom companies that are reliant upon space-based systems. And so looking at something like UFO, or even just looking at the broader space industry, these are all things that are now becoming investable today. And you mentioned the billionaires that are kind of going off on their own projects. Governments are already becoming reliant upon SpaceX. And if you look at their future launch calendar, there are numerous countries and military efforts as well as commercial efforts that are all signed up for future SpaceX rocket launches. And many of the companies that are actually in UFO are actually benefited by these launches, because you look at what the payloads are carrying, and it might be satellites built by some of the component companies in UFO, or it's actually that company itself that's launching a network and using SpaceX rockets to help them get there. So we'll see this industry continue to evolve, but really space does have everyday implications for us already, and it's really exciting to see the new technologies that are being developed that are going to help us expand on those capabilities.
Well, I tell you, Andrew, you've definitely changed my mental anchoring of what space means as it relates to investing. I didn't even think of companies like Uber struggling if there was not a space economy. And I'd like to get into your ETF and how you construct it. But first, let's start with why. Why did the marketplace need a space-specific ETF?
So for me, when developing ETFs, it's trying to look at these long-term transformational technologies in many cases. And it's finding those thematic opportunities that haven't been captured already by the ETF industry. So the first is coming up with a theme that I think people actually want to invest in. And then once you actually build out that concept, and we actually worked with an index provider and a partner of theirs that was a former director of the Space Foundation, so someone that truly understood the space industry. It's assembling that team that understands it, that can build that index for you. And then lastly, once you look at that index, you're actually providing a new exposure for investors. If you're just throwing a fancy name on something and you're reweighting it by a little bit, at the end of the day, someone could be getting that same exact exposure at a significantly lower fee. You're not really providing anything of use for anyone. And if anything, you fall, the risk of creating a gimmick fund. But for me, seeing that, the space industry is already roughly a $384 billion industry, seeing that investment banks and research houses around the world are starting to build out research departments focusing on this industry, and seeing how this industry also is becoming less reliant upon governments and is really being stimulated by the growth of commercial interest, made it seem like this was an industry that was ready for an ETF to track it.
Awesome. So let's get granular to the degree we can on a podcast. And I think we should probably speak about the index that the ETF tracks. Tell me, how is the index constructed? And then could you talk about some of the holdings that advisors could expect to see in this if they were going to allocate to it?
So this is the first pure play focused fund on the space industry, as you had mentioned. And by that means that at least 80% of the weight in the fund is focused on companies that receive a majority of their revenues from space-related activities. And so that you might ask, what's the next 20%? 20% or less of the fund is allowed to be invested in these more diversified companies that are major players in the space industry, but it's not necessarily the driving force behind the company. So some of those diversified companies, are kind of more your industrial, aerospace and defense names. Think Boeing, think Airbus, think Lockheed, those names that are doing a lot in space, but not really driving the bottom line for them. Mm-hmm. So the companies that you are getting are ground equipment and manufacturing companies, rocket and satellite manufacturing and operation, satellite-based telecommunications, radio, television broadcasting, space-based imagery and intelligence services, companies making space technology and hardware, and also, kind of the defense and military side of the space industry. So you're getting a really interesting mix that there's no other ETF out there that's providing you with the same type of exposure and concentration in some of these satellite and rocket names. So, the index was actually developed by, I mentioned, a former director at the Space Foundation, and it was actually the first ever index to be recognized by the Space Foundation as a certified space data product. So it's the first ever anything to actually receive that recognition from the Space Foundation, which we thought was very exciting as well.
I'm sure, yeah. So how many holdings in the index?
So at this moment, there are roughly 32 names in the fund, and the index providers are constantly looking at that expanding universe of potential companies, finding out which ones are actually involved in the space industry, and looking at the amount of revenues derived from actual space activities.
Okay, so to kind of put a bow on this, the index or fund is going to have, less than 50 names. 80% of those companies are going to get earn the majority of their revenue from space products. 20% could be some larger companies that don't necessarily have a majority of the revenue coming from it. So then if an advisor was to put this into, dare I say, Morningstar, what type of market cap would they see? What type of style box would they see? And how do you think they could consider positioning it in a client portfolio?
So, no pun intended, this could be a satellite type of holding. In no way is this typically a core exposure for someone.
You were sandbagging that. That was great. It's a satellite holding.
I don't think I've used that yet, but I might try to keep using that one.
Yeah.
If it works. But someone that believes in this growth of the space industry. I mean, Morgan Stanley was out there saying that they believe the space industry will be $1.1 trillion by 2040. Bank of America had an even more optimistic view that by 2045, space industry would be a $2.7 trillion industry. So someone that believes in this potential of space, believes that all these other transformational technologies that we originally mentioned, that those technologies are going to be reliant on space or heavy users and supporters of the space economy, this could be one way to play many of these transformational trends. Even someone that's looking to learn more about the investing in world, they might be interested in space already. This is something that might give them some of those exposures that they're looking to get. And also, it's a global equity fund. So not only you're getting exposure to companies in the U.S., but it might be difficult for many investors to get the global exposure to this industry. And this fund is a global fund. So the majority of the names are U.S. based, but you're also seeing Canadian and Italian exposure, as well as Japanese. So this is a global industry, and the fund is looking at that global universe for selection.
Excellent. A global satellite addition to a portfolio. Andrew, how could listeners find out more about your firm and the ETF UFO?
You can visit us at ProcureETFs.com or follow us on Twitter at ProcureAM_LLC.
Awesome. Andrew, I learned a lot on this episode. Thanks for coming on.
Thanks for having me, Jay.